Just when you thought it was safe to pick up your next tube amp, xDuoo comes along and makes the decision more complicated. With the countless tube amps littering Amazon, AliExpress, eBay, and other online retailers, it seems like the entire product line is basically covered. But there is one striking problem. Tube amps rarely have built-in DACs. xDuoo's newest tube amp, the MH-02, is going to change that oversight. This product costs $150 and might just entice you to spend a bit of cash. The folks at Shenzhen Audio were kind enough to send me the MH-02 for review. Check out their website if you're looking for your next audiophile fix. Shenzhen Audio carries not just the mainstream products but also some gear unique to Asia and not easily found in other parts of the world. Now let's delve into the MH-02. The MH-02 is in fact a dual-purpose amp. It's actually a amp DAC, as I mentioned. Inside there's a singular CS43131 DAC chip, which measures very well and has a neutral clinical decoding capability. The MH-02 supports all high-resolution PCM and DSD up to 256. Sorry, no MQA for those who care. If you don't want to use the 43131, the MH-02 has RCA input, so you can connect any DAC you want. The MH-02 can also act as a preamplifier through its RCA output. Keep in mind, this is not for unpowered speakers, so it's really not an amplifier. You will need powered speakers, but the MH-02 will let you modulate the volume. The MH-02 will prioritize USB input. If you connect this amp by RCA input and USB input at once, it will automatically select the USB connection. You will need to physically disconnect from USB to use the RCA input. The MH-02 has Class A amplification. I briefly talked about this in my last review, which was for the xDuoo TA20+. In summary, Class A amplification draws the amp's maximum power from the grid from the moment the amp is turned on. All the power the amp is capable of is available at all volumes from the beginning. And this is not energy efficient. This Class A power means that the MH-02 has 1.3 watts available at all times, or at least that's what xDuoo says. I was not able to find third-party measurements, so I don't know if this power output is accurate. The MH-02 has quarter-inch, 4.4mm balanced, and 3.5mm headphone jacks. The balanced is not true balanced, of course, but it makes connecting your headphones easier since you get the entire panoply of modern headphone connections. The amp uses dual 6J1 Chinese tubes. These are equivalent to the EF95, 6J1B, and the 5591 tubes, so you should be able to find plenty of alternatives if you want to tube roll. Aesthetically, the MH-02 is, well, tiny. It is a palm-sized device. The design follows xDuoo's modernism, which is consistent throughout their recent products. The MH-02 is made entirely of metal. The front panel is simple. The 3 headphone outputs, metal volume knob, and the gain selector switch are all you get. The volume knob is flanked by blue LEDs, which cannot be changed in any way. The rear panel is also simple. Power in, RCA in, USB-C in, and RCA output. The MH-02 connects seamlessly to PC, Mac, iOS, and Android devices through USB, which is fantastic. A tiny device like this should be able to connect to all modern devices, and it will cater to anybody who, for whatever reason, wants to run a very minimal system. Overall, the MH-02 has everything the majority of audiophiles need. Full PCM support, theoretically superb power output, a good DAC chipset, and multi-connection options. It is built well and takes up very little room on the desk. Some of what I say is going to sound similar to what I said in my last review for the xDuoo TA20+, and frankly, that can't be helped. I use the MH-02 for over a month as one of my go-to desktop amps. I have several tube amplifiers, including the Jolita Glass FX Tube DAC, Woo Audio WA7 2nd Gen, Quad PA1, Felix Euphoria, and the Monolith Liquid Platinum. I've done a fair amount of tube rolling in the past. I've owned the Dark Voice 336 SE, which was my first proper tube amp, and I did do a fair bit of tube rolling with it. I have some experience with tube amps and DACs, just to put it mildly. I'm a fan of these products when they are done right. There's a sector of audiophiles who wax poetic about clinically clean DACs and claim that those DACs have sound signatures. That is not the case, not evidenced by measurements or by true volume-matched A/B tests. But tube amps do affect the sound. They introduce harmonic distortion, that is, distortion that you can hear. That's their whole purpose for audiophiles. Every type of tube, and arguably even tubes in the same family structure, have different distortion capabilities. Sometimes the variances are slight, and sometimes they are pretty obvious. Sadly, tube rolling is a trial and error process, which can be very expensive if you delve too deep. Now for this test, I dispense with my typical A/B testing methodology because of what I just explained. There's little point doing those kinds of tests for hours and hours when we already know that tubes sound different among their respective devices, so to speak. But I did conduct some cursory A/B tests for a few days. I compared the MH-02 against all the amps I previously mentioned. I plugged them into the same DAC, and I used both the Brooklyn DAC Plus and the K&I DAC 6 for that purpose. And of course, I listened to the MH-02 plugged directly into USB. I had two questions. First, does the MH-02 exhibit the same tubey sound and experience that I've come to expect from true tube amplifiers? Second, does the MH-02's tube sound profile appear to be somewhat different from the other amps I listened to? To the first question, yes, the MH-02 does have a form of tubey sound. However, the MH-02 is not going to provide you the harmonic distortion of larger, beefier tube amps. Frankly, if you compare something like the Dark Voice to the MH-02, you will end up thinking that the MH-02 doesn't sound much like a tube amp. Remember, a tube amp's harmonic distortion is the tube sound. Tubes that produce little audible distortion may not have any appreciable effect on your music. Sadly, that's just the case for any tiny tube amp. So just keep your expectations in check. The MH-02 does alter the sound, but to a degree. You know, often cheap tubes will need some break in time. Bad tubes will never correctly settle in, and you will hear pops and sizzles and some really unpleasant distortion. I've had that happen when I purchased really cheap tubes or simply did not properly match my tube selections. Wait, that was a fault. The MH-02's tubes are not really like that. From the moment I turned on this amp and let it warm up, these tubes were ready to go. I never heard a hint of annoying hiss or pops or sizzles that I would on a cheap tube. More to the point, when I plugged simply into the Brooklyn DAC Plus and compared against the MH-02, I heard very minimal alteration to the sound. The MH-02 produced slightly greater mid-bass and maybe longer bass decay. The treble seems slightly reduced on the MH-02. The Brooklyn DAC Plus is a neutral amp DAC, so it's a perfect baseline for this kind of quick comparison. Now the second question I had was whether the MH-02 sounded different from the other tube amps I tried. Yes, but not necessarily in the way you might want. As I said before, the MH-02 has a slight tubey sound. The harmonic distortion is quite minimal. The larger tube amps produced warmer presentation, more bass in general compared to the MH-02. Only the Monolith Liquid Platinum sounded similar to the MH-02, and that's because the Liquid Platinum doesn't really produce sufficient harmonic distortion and isn't an OTL tube amp. I've said this in the past when I've reviewed solid-state tube amp hybrids. They are fine as a starting point for tube enthusiasts and do offer something, but their tube effect is very limited. Sometimes tube rolling can change that, and you might get a bit more mileage from a different set of tubes. But that kind of tube rolling on a hybrid amp can get expensive, and you might end up being unhappy with all of that effort. It's just the nature of these small tube amps. Now, finally, about that 1.3 watts number. As I said before, there's no way for me to verify whether you're actually going to get 1.3 watts out of the MH-02. What I did do, however, was, I threw a lot of my headphones at it. I used 600 ohm dynamic drivers, I used large planar magnetics, I used smaller planar magnetics, I used the Modhaus Argon, And frankly, my experience was that this amp does properly drive the vast majority of gear that I have. I didn't feel that the Modhouse Argon really got that beefy, bassy nature that it typically is known for, but that could have been just my listening session on this occasion. After repeated hearings, I still don't believe that the MH-02 can properly drive the Argon. Now, the Argon does need a minimum of 1 watt at 50 ohms, and I'm not quite sure the MH-02 is capable of providing 1 watt, let alone 1.3 watts, based from just what I've experienced. I could be wrong, but that's how I felt. Overall, the MH-02 is a tiny tube hybrid amp that excels in style, build, and utility. And frankly, I think it does offer plenty of power for the vast majority of headphones, to say nothing about those really easy to drive IEMs. If you're not inclined to spend several $100s on a tube OTL amp, hybrid tube amps like the MH-02 can make you pretty happy. You don't need to spend $150, however. The Little Bear series of portable tube amps can replicate what the MH-02 kind of sounds like. But the Little Bear and its kind of amps come with a huge problem. They create a lot of tube ringing whenever they're bumped. As portable as those devices are supposed to be, their portability is greatly reduced when you cannot carry them anywhere. On the other hand, the MH-02 is a perfect little companion for your desktop. With a built-in DAC, you don't need to even worry about adding more to the audio chain, and you get the tube roll if you want. Frankly, I think the MH-02 is a good product. I wish it had a more tube-like sound, but I'm not surprised that it cannot compete with actual OTL amps. As long as you understand this product's limitations, I think it does offer good value, build, and a pleasing sound.